Part 5. Reality Television and the Mass Market Brand, 2004 to 2014. Chapter 41. Primetime Rebirth. The boardroom had been built on the 26th floor of Trump Tower at a cost that the production company absorbed without complaint, because Mark Burnett understood with the certainty of a man who had survived the Australian outback on a production budget and come out the other side with a hit television franchise, that the room had to feel like money before a single frame was shot. The long mahogany table was real mahogany. The chairs were leather of a specific weight and darkness. The Manhattan skyline arranged itself through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the cooperative grandeur of a backdrop that no set designer could have improved upon. And the lighting, warm, slightly theatrical, the kind of light that makes every face look like it is being considered for something important, had been calibrated over several days of testing until it achieved the precise quality that Burnett's eye required. When Donald Trump walked into that room for the first camera rehearsal in the autumn of 2003, he stood at the head of the table and put both hands flat on its surface and looked down its length the way a general looks down a valley he has decided to take. And the crew, which had worked with enough television personalities to recognize the difference between someone performing authority and someone who actually possessed it, went quiet in the particular way that crews go quiet when they understand that the thing they are making might be something real. The pilot had not yet aired. The network had not yet committed to a full season order beyond the standard pilot pickup. The press had not yet decided what to make of the concept. A reality competition in which young business aspirants competed for a job in the Trump Organization, with Trump himself presiding over their elimination with a phrase that Burnett had workshopped and Trump had immediately claimed as his own. None of that existed yet. What existed was the room, and the table, and the man at its head, and the quiet certainty shared by Burnett and Trump, and a small number of people at NBC who had seen the rough cuts, that something was about to happen. To understand why January 2004, the month The Apprentice premiered on NBC, represented not merely a television event, but a genuine reinvention of a public figure, one must appreciate the precise condition of that figure's reputation in the years immediately preceding it. The tabloid decade of the 90s had done its work. The bankruptcies had been public and prolonged. The divorce from Ivana, the affair with Marla, the second marriage and its eventual dissolution, the debt restructurings conducted in the full glare of New York's financial press, all of it had accumulated into a portrait of a man who was, by most sophisticated assessments of the late 1990s, a diminished figure. Not finished. Trump was never finished, and his enemies had repeatedly made the mistake of betting that he was, but reduced, operating on a smaller stage than his ambitions required, forced to license his name to other people's buildings in markets he had never visited, because the capital to build his own was no longer available to him on terms he could accept. The Reform Party flirtation had been covered with a kind of amused tolerance that barely concealed its condescension. He was, in the consensus view of the media and business establishment entering the new century, a cautionary tale dressed in a good suit, a man whose story was instructive precisely because it illustrated the distance between the image of success and its structural foundations. What Burnett grasped, and what the NBC executives who greenlit the show grasped after him, was that this consensus was not only wrong, but wrong in a way that was itself an opportunity. The American television audience in 2003 did not share the media establishment's complicated relationship with Trump's history. They knew him as a name on buildings they had seen in movies, as a figure who appeared on talk shows and said entertaining and outrageous things, as a man who seemed, in the shorthand of celebrity recognition, to embody a fantasy of New York wealth that was specific and vivid and aspirational in ways that the actual mechanics of his financial history could not touch. The nuance of the bankruptcy proceedings meant nothing to a viewer in Tulsa or Charlotte or Sacramento who had never followed the Wall Street Journal's coverage of the Taj Mahal's debt restructuring. What they knew was the image, and the image was intact, and Burnett's genius was to build a television format around the image rather than the reality, to construct a weekly 60-minute argument that Donald Trump was the most successful businessman in America, at precisely the moment when the documentary evidence for that proposition was, at best, ambiguous. The central conflict of this chapter was not between Trump and the network or Trump and Burnett. Those relationships were characterized from the beginning by the productive alignment of complementary interests, but between the persona that the show required and the man who was being asked to perform it. The Apprentice needed Trump to be something specific, decisive, authoritative, the final and unchallengeable arbiter of business merit, a figure whose judgment was so self-evidently superior that young people competed across weeks of grueling tasks for the privilege of working for him. This was not, in its broad outlines, a persona foreign to Trump's self-conception. He had always believed in the superiority of his own judgment. But the show required the belief to be performed consistently, week after week, in a controlled environment, according to a structure that Burnett's production team had designed with considerable care, and the performance had to be convincing, not to a boardroom of bankers or a room of real estate developers, but to 20 million Americans eating dinner in front of their televisions. The scale was different. The medium was different. And Trump, for all his instinctive understanding of media, had never done this particular thing before. What happened instead, the surprise that Burnett would later describe as the essential discovery of the production, was that Trump did not need to learn to perform authority for the camera. He needed only to be redirected slightly, focused, given a structure within which his natural instincts could operate without the distractions of his actual business life. In the boardroom, with the candidates arrayed before him and the cameras running, he was not acting. He was doing what he had done in offices and negotiating rooms for 40 years, reading people, identifying weakness, finding the pressure point in an argument, and pressing it until something gave. The phrase, "you're fired," which Burnett had suggested, and which Trump had at first resisted on the grounds that it sounded unnecessarily harsh, turned out to be the syntactic nucleus around which the entire show's dramatic logic organized itself. Trump delivered it differently each episode, sometimes with visible regret, sometimes with the brisk satisfaction of a man clearing an obstacle, sometimes with a rhetorical buildup that gave it the quality of a verdict being handed down. The variation was not scripted. It was the product of a man who understood, at the cellular level, that repetition without variation is death in any performance, and who had been giving performances his entire professional life. The specific anecdote that most clearly illuminates his relationship with the show's production, the keyhole through which his character in this new context becomes fully visible, involves a dispute over the boardroom's physical arrangement that occurred during the first week of filming. Burnett's producers had positioned Trump's chair at the head of the table in the conventional manner, with the two candidates facing elimination seated across from each other and Trump presiding from one end. It was logical, it was clean, and it was wrong in a way that Trump identified almost immediately upon sitting in the chair and looking down the table. The arrangement made him too distant from the action. The drama was happening at the other end of the table among the candidates, and he was watching it from across the room like an audience member rather than the central character. He stopped the rehearsal. He moved chairs. He repositioned the candidates, brought them closer, restructured the physical geometry of the room until the camera angles had to be rearranged to accommodate the new configuration. The producers, protective of a shot list that had taken days to plan, were not initially pleased. Burnett, who listened to the argument Trump was making, walked the room himself, looked at the angles, and concluded that Trump was right. The rearrangement stayed. And the boardroom, as it appeared on American television for the next 14 seasons, had at its spatial and dramatic center exactly what Trump had understood it needed. Not a distant authority figure presiding over events from the head of a table, but a man close enough to the conflict to be inside it, whose presence was not supervisory but participatory, who was not watching the drama but driving it. The relationship that defined the creative partnership of The Apprentice, and that illuminates something essential about how Trump operated whenever he found a genuine collaborator rather than a subordinate, was the one with Mark Burnett himself. Burnett was 43 years old when the show premiered, a British-born former paratrooper who had arrived in Los Angeles in the late 1980s with almost no money and had built, through Survivor and The Apprentice, and a subsequent library of successful formats, one of the most successful production companies in the history of American television. He was not a man who was easily impressed or easily managed, and he had worked with enough large personalities to understand the difference between a star who enhanced a format and one who consumed it. What he found in Trump was, by his own later description, something genuinely unusual. A subject who was not performing for the camera in the anxious, effortful way of most celebrities, but who seemed to experience the camera as a natural element, the way a fish experiences water, not as an intrusion but as a condition of existence. Burnett gave Trump structure and format, and the creative infrastructure of a well-funded production. Trump gave Burnett something that no production budget could manufacture: the quality of unperformed authority, the sense that the room was organized around him, not because the cameras said so, but because the man himself required it. Their partnership was characterized by a mutual respect that neither man entirely advertised. Trump because admiring a collaborator's contribution was not a mode he reached for naturally. Burnett because the business of television production required maintaining clear lines of creative authority, but that was visible in the decisions they made together. When Burnett proposed changes to the format, Trump engaged with them seriously rather than dismissing them as an intrusion on his prerogatives. When Trump insisted on specific elements of the boardroom dynamic, Burnett found ways to accommodate them within the production's needs. It was, in the vocabulary of the entertainment business, a functioning creative marriage, and its product, the show that premiered on January 8, 2004, and drew over 20 million viewers to its first episode, and would go on to average between 17 and 20 million viewers across its first several seasons, was the most consequential reinvention of a public figure's image that American television had yet produced. The premiere's numbers arrived the following morning, and they were not what the cautious projections had suggested. They were significantly better. NBC's research department, which had tracked the show's awareness and anticipation metrics through the preceding weeks of promotion, had predicted a solid but not spectacular opening. What arrived instead was a cultural event, the water cooler moment that television executives dream about and rarely get, the show that everyone had apparently watched and needed to discuss the next day at work. The boardroom phrase was already being repeated, already being applied ironically and sincerely in offices and schools across the country. Trump appeared on the Today Show the morning after the premiere and sat across from Matt Lauer with the specific quality of composure that belongs to a man who has just had something confirmed that he already knew. He was not surprised by the numbers. He had watched the rough cuts. He had understood what the show was. What he was in that morning interview was satisfied, the satisfaction of a man who has been right about something important after a long period of being told he was wrong. The show ran. The seasons accumulated. The ratings remained, through the first half of the decade, in the range that made The Apprentice one of NBC's most valuable properties and Trump one of the network's most valuable assets. His licensing deals multiplied as the show's audience expanded his name into demographics and geographies that his real estate portfolio had never reached. The Trump brand, which had been a New York phenomenon with aspirational reach among a specific class of wealthy buyers, became something approaching a mass-market phenomenon, a name that a schoolteacher in Phoenix or a factory worker in Michigan recognized not from a building's facade but from a Thursday night television habit. The distance between the man and the myth, which had always existed but had been navigable when the myth was primarily a regional one, was expanding at a velocity that no single person in Trump's organization, not Burnett, not the NBC executives, not Trump himself, was fully tracking. The persona that 20 million Americans were meeting each week in the boardroom was not precisely the man. It was the man's best performance of himself, edited and shaped and lit by professionals whose job it was to make him appear exactly as the format required. And the audience, which had no particular reason to interrogate the distance between the performance and the reality, was absorbing the performance as fact, building from it a mental image of Donald Trump, businessman and decision-maker, an avatar of American commercial success that would prove in the years ahead to be far more politically potent than anyone eating dinner in front of their television in January 2004 could possibly have imagined. Chapter 42. Catchphrases and Power. The boardroom set had been built on the 24th floor of Trump Tower, in a space that had been cleared and dressed with the specific intention of communicating authority at a frequency that a television camera could transmit into a living room. The long mahogany table, the leather chairs, the backlit Trump logo on the wall behind the chair at the head of the table, positioned at exactly the height that would appear in the frame whenever the camera was on the man sitting beneath it. The production designers from Mark Burnett's company, United Artists Television, had consulted with Trump on the details, and Trump had engaged with the consultation the way he engaged with his lobby restorations, with an attention to the communicative function of each physical element that went beyond aesthetic preference into something closer to semiotics. The flowers on the table were real. The wood was dark and dense. The lighting was warm enough to avoid the fluorescent harshness of actual corporate interiors, but cool enough to suggest that real decisions were made here, that the room had consequence. When Trump sat down in the chair at the head of that table for the first time, and the cameras rolled, he did not look like a man performing authority. He looked like a man returning to a room where authority was native to him, which was, in the grammar of television, exactly the same thing. The Apprentice premiered on NBC on January 8, 2004, at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and the numbers that came back the following morning were of the kind that caused network executives to revise their assumptions about what they thought they knew. 28 million viewers had watched the first episode, a figure that placed the show immediately among the most-watched programs of the season, and that NBC, which had been navigating the post-Friends landscape with the particular anxiety of a network that had lost its defining franchise, processed as both a commercial rescue and a cultural event. The show had been developed by Mark Burnett, the British-born producer, whose Survivor had demonstrated 4 years earlier that reality competition television could generate the kind of appointment viewing that had previously been the exclusive province of scripted drama. Burnett's instinct, which proved correct with a precision that even he likely did not fully anticipate, was that the business competition format, teams of candidates competing for a job, evaluated on their performance in tasks designed to test commercial creativity and executive decision-making, could carry the same narrative weight as a survival competition if the prize was rendered sufficiently aspirational and the judge rendered sufficiently formidable. Trump in 2004 was operating in a specific cultural position that the show both reflected and accelerated. The bankruptcy years were sufficiently distant to have faded from active cultural memory, replaced by the recovered brand of the late 1990s. The 40 Wall Street renovation, Trump World Tower, the golf courses, and by the social visibility of the Melania period. He was famous in New York in the comprehensive way that New York figures of sufficient duration and notoriety achieve a kind of ambient celebrity that is no longer contingent on specific achievement, that attaches to the name and the face independently of whatever the name and face are currently connected to. Nationally, he was known, recognizable, associated with Manhattan real estate and tabloid life, but not ubiquitous. The Apprentice changed that ratio completely and irreversibly. By the end of the first season, Trump was not a New York figure with national name recognition. He was a national figure, full stop, present in the weekly rhythm of American television consumption in a way that no building opening or magazine profile or Reform Party exploration had achieved or could have achieved, because those events were discrete and The Apprentice was continuous, arriving in living rooms every Thursday evening and maintaining its presence in the cultural conversation throughout the week via the workplace discussions and the tabloid coverage and the proliferating merchandise that Burnett's licensing operation was already generating before the first season concluded. The core conflict that Trump faced in this period was one of translation, specifically, the challenge of translating a persona that had been constructed for and legible within a specific New York context into something that would carry meaning and generate response across the full geographic and demographic range of the American television audience. The people who watched The Apprentice in Des Moines and Phoenix and suburban Atlanta had no experiential reference for Trump the New York developer, no frame for understanding what it meant to put your name on a building on Fifth Avenue or to restructure a casino debt with a consortium of institutional lenders. What they had was the boardroom, and the boardroom worked because Burnett's production team understood how to render it as a universal space, a room where the dynamics of ambition and evaluation and judgment were legible to anyone who had ever wanted something professionally and wondered whether they were good enough to get it. Trump's role in that space required him to perform something that was simultaneously specific: his actual history, his actual buildings, his actual wealth, all of it explicitly present in the show's narrative, and universal, legible as authority and discernment to viewers who had no means of independently verifying the specifics and no particular need to do so. What he discovered, with a speed that suggests the aptitude was latent rather than developed, was that he was extraordinarily good at television in the particular way that the boardroom format required. The elimination scenes, in which the losing team was brought before Trump and he interrogated their performance, allocated blame, and concluded with the dismissal of the episode's designated failure, were the show's structural climax, and Trump presided over them with a quality of engagement that was distinctive in the reality television landscape. He was not cruel in the manner of some competition show judges, whose dismissals carried a personal contempt that the audience could process as entertainment, but not as authority. He was not warm in the manner of coaches and mentors, whose approval the contestants sought, and whose disappointment carried an emotional charge. He was something more specifically executive in register, interested in the performance, impatient with the excuse, willing to be persuaded by argument but not by appeal, and capable of rendering the final verdict with a brevity that communicated finality without requiring elaboration. The phrase, "you're fired," was, in its context, a compression of all of this into two words that could be read on a bumper sticker or heard across a noisy bar or processed in the half-attention of a viewer folding laundry, and that retained, in every register of reception, its essential content. Someone had decided, and the decision was not subject to appeal. The anecdote that serves as the keyhole into Trump's relationship with the show, and into the particular kind of intelligence he brought to its production, involves his engagement with the editing process, which in reality television is where the narrative is actually constructed. Burnett's production generated hundreds of hours of footage per season, from which the editors assembled the episodes that aired, and the decisions made in the editing room, which moments to include, which to omit, how to sequence the footage to build narrative tension and character coherence, were the decisions that determined not merely what the audience saw, but who the audience believed each participant to be. Trump, who was not a television professional and had no formal standing in the editing process, nevertheless involved himself in it with a persistence that the production team found remarkable, and that Burnett accommodated because accommodating it served the show's interests. Trump's instincts about what worked, which sequences were compelling, which candidates were being rendered in ways that would sustain viewer investment across an episode or a season, were, by the accounts of people who worked on the production, genuinely reliable. He had processed enough media coverage of himself, over enough decades, to understand how image was constructed through selective presentation, and he applied that understanding to the show's raw material with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting his entire professional life for a medium that gave him direct access to the construction process rather than requiring him to influence it from the outside through press calls and controlled access. The relationship that defined the Apprentice period, that was, in its structural importance, the closest analog to a genuine creative partnership Trump entered during these years, was the one with Mark Burnett himself. Burnett was in 2004 the most commercially successful producer in American unscripted television, which meant he occupied a position of influence within the NBC programming apparatus that gave him a degree of creative protection unusual in network television. He was also, in temperament and background, sufficiently different from Trump to create a productive rather than redundant collaboration. Where Trump was native to New York and to the specific register of its real estate and tabloid culture, Burnett was British by birth and Hollywood by operational base, less interested in the specific content of the Trump mythology than in its structural utility, in what it could do for a show that needed a protagonist with genuine authority rather than performed authority. Burnett understood that the boardroom worked because Trump's history, even imperfectly known, even filtered through 15 years of tabloid coverage, gave the judgments weight that a hired actor or a lesser-known executive could not have generated. The history was the credential, and the credential was what made the firing real. Their working relationship was not warm in the social sense. They were not friends in the way that the word implies a relationship independent of professional utility, but it was genuinely collaborative in the sense that each brought something the other required, and each understood this with sufficient clarity to make the collaboration function efficiently across multiple seasons without the friction that ego-driven partnerships typically generate. The show's commercial success generated a secondary economy of brand extension that Trump managed with the same instincts he had applied to the licensing architecture he had been building since the mid-1990s. The Apprentice brand, the tagline, the catchphrase, the specific visual grammar of the boardroom, was licensed onto products that extended the show's reach into retail and into the daily material life of consumers who had no engagement with New York real estate and no aspiration to it, but who could purchase a piece of the authority the show communicated through a book, a board game, a line of branded merchandise. Trump's own publishing output expanded during this period, books that were explicitly connected to the show's themes: The Way to the Top, Trump, How to Get Rich, Think Like a Billionaire, and that found audiences that his pre-Apprentice publishing had reached only partially because the show had created a national readership where previously there had been a regional one. The books were not rigorous business texts in the manner of management literature produced by academics or McKinsey partners. They were, in their form and content, extensions of the boardroom persona, declarative, anecdotal, structured around Trump's own experience as the primary source of their authority, and addressed to readers who wanted access to the psychology of success rather than its mechanics. What was happening across all of these extensions, the show, the merchandise, the books, the increased speaking fees, the licensing deals that the show's ratings made possible in markets that had previously been inaccessible, was the completion of a transformation that had been structurally underway since the mid-1990s, but that The Apprentice accelerated into a different categorical register. Trump had spent the decade after the bankruptcies rebuilding the brand as a real estate and luxury product proposition. The show converted the brand into a mass-market cultural phenomenon, something that operated in the register of entertainment rather than aspiration, that was accessible to consumers who would never purchase a Trump-branded apartment or stay in a Trump hotel, but who could watch Thursday night television and participate in the experience of the brand through that act of viewership. The audience for The Apprentice was not the audience for Trump World Tower. It was, in demographic terms, a much larger and more economically diverse group. And the fact that they engaged with the brand through a different medium did not diminish the engagement. It deepened and broadened it in ways that the luxury positioning alone could never have achieved. The question that this broadening raised, and that would not receive its answer for another decade, was what the mass market audience was actually absorbing through those Thursday night viewings. The show offered a theory of American success that was specific in its details and universal in its appeal, that excellence was identifiable, that judgment could be exercised with confidence, that the complexity of organizational life could be resolved into clear verdicts, that the person at the head of the table who had built something real had earned the right to decide who was good enough and who was not. These were not politically neutral propositions. They carried within them a set of assumptions about authority and merit, and the relationship between demonstrated success and the right to judge that resonated differently in different portions of the American electorate, that felt to some viewers like a description of how things ought to work, and to others like a version of how things already worked that they were glad to see reflected back to them. Trump was not, in 2004 or 2005 or 2006, making political arguments on The Apprentice. He was making entertainment. But the entertainment was encoding a set of values that would prove, when the right conditions eventually materialized, to be remarkably transferable into the language of a political campaign. And the audience that had been receiving those values weekly for a decade would prove, when asked, to have absorbed them more deeply than anyone in either the entertainment industry or the political establishment had thought to measure or prepare for. Chapter 43. Developing Golf Portfolios. He walked the 18th fairway at Bedminster alone or nearly alone. There was always someone trailing at a respectful distance, a club professional or a course superintendent or a member of his security detail who had learned to read the specific quality of his silence and understand that it required space. And what he was doing was not inspecting so much as imagining. The grass was still rough in places, still bearing the scars of the transformation he had set in motion on the old Lamington farm property in Somerset County, New Jersey, a rolling expanse of central Jersey countryside that had been, before he acquired it, a horse farm of distinguished lineage and no particular commercial future. He stopped at a point on the fairway where the land fell away slightly, and the view opened toward the hills in the middle distance, and he stood there for a long moment with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, not speaking, looking at something that no one else present could quite see. Then he turned to the superintendent and said, with the specificity of a man describing a memory rather than a plan, exactly what he wanted the bunker placement to look like on the left side of the approach. And the superintendent, who had worked for other wealthy golf course owners and understood the type, recognized immediately that this was not a suggestion. It was a vision being transmitted, and his job was to receive it accurately. The acquisition of what would become Trump National Golf Club Bedminster, which opened in 2004, and would eventually host major USGA championships, and serve as the property Trump most publicly identified as his personal retreat, was not an isolated transaction but the flagship expression of a strategy that had been developing across the preceding decade with the patient deliberateness of a campaign. Golf had entered Trump's life with the particular force of a late discovery, the kind that arrives in middle age and reorganizes everything around it. He had taken up the game seriously in the 1980s, and had pursued it with the competitive intensity he brought to everything, practicing obsessively, playing with professionals who could test his game, shaving his handicap with the methodical ambition of a man who did not accept mediocrity in himself in any domain he chose to enter. But the transition from passionate player to course developer and owner, was not simply the natural extension of personal enthusiasm. It was the recognition, arrived at somewhere in the wreckage of the bankruptcy years, that golf courses were a vehicle uniquely suited to the kind of value creation his new capital-light model required. The mid-2000s were a particular moment for American golf. Tiger Woods had spent the preceding decade transforming the sport's demographics and cultural reach in ways that the country clubs of his grandfather's era could not have imagined, drawing to the game a television audience that was younger, more diverse, and more numerous than anything the sport had previously commanded, and with it a wave of investment and development that had produced new courses at a rate not seen since the post-war boom. The equipment industry was generating billions. Golf real estate, the residential communities built around courses, where proximity to the fairway commanded premiums over comparable inland properties, was among the most sought-after categories in the American housing market. The sport had not merely survived its patrician associations, it had monetized them, converted the inherited prestige of the country club into a brand category that could be packaged and sold to the expanding affluent class that the decade's bull market was producing. Trump, who understood branding at a cellular level, and who understood golf from the inside as a player, read these conditions with the clarity of a man who had been waiting for exactly this configuration to appear. The conflict that shaped this chapter of his business life was not primarily financial. The golf acquisitions, unlike the casino ventures and the leveraged real estate of the 1980s, were structured with a discipline that reflected everything he had learned about the difference between ambition and overextension. The conflict was competitive and reputational, operating on two distinct fronts that required different tools. The first front was the golf world itself, which had its own aristocracy and its own standards, and was not automatically inclined to embrace a real estate developer with a television show as a peer. The established clubs, Augusta National, Winged Foot, Shinnecock Hills, the great American courses that existed in the sport's institutional imagination as cathedrals, had been built over decades by committees and memberships and green superintendents whose authority derived from tradition rather than capital. Trump was proposing to enter this world, not by ascending its existing hierarchy, but by constructing a parallel one, by building or acquiring courses, and declaring them superior through the force of investment and promotion and personal assertion. This was, in the golf world's terms, an audacious position. It attracted skepticism from the traditionalists, and enthusiasm from a different constituency, the newly wealthy, the self-made, the men and women for whom Augusta's ballot box exclusivity was not an aspiration but an irritant. And Trump understood, with his unfailing instinct for finding the audience that wanted what he was selling, that the second group was larger and growing faster than the first. The second front was local, and in some respects more immediately consequential. Each acquisition came embedded in a specific community with specific relationships between land use, municipal revenue, environmental regulation, and the interests of existing residents. And Trump's approach to these local conflicts followed a pattern that his critics found aggressive and his supporters found refreshingly direct. At his Rancho Palos Verde property in California, a clifftop course of spectacular beauty overlooking the Pacific, acquired in 2002, the battle over erosion control and coastal access rights with the local homeowners and environmental agencies consumed years and produced litigation that was still unresolved when the course opened. At Ferry Point in the Bronx, a municipal course he was developing under contract with New York City, the negotiations over terms and timeline were protracted enough that the project would not open until 2015, more than a decade after the initial agreement. He did not experience these conflicts as setbacks. He experienced them as negotiations conducted in a different venue, by different rules, with a different set of leverage points. And he was, in the estimation of several attorneys who opposed him in these matters, a more sophisticated adversary in local land use disputes than his public persona suggested. The revealing action, the moment that opens the widest window into his character as a golf course developer, took place at the property in Bedminster during the course's design phase, when the architect Phil Mickelson, the PGA Tour champion whom Trump had engaged as a design consultant, arrived to walk the land and provide input on the routing. The collaboration was, from the beginning, an unusual one. Mickelson was among the best golfers alive, with a player's intimate understanding of what made a hole challenging and memorable, while Trump was an owner with a specific and strongly held vision of what his course should be, and more importantly, should look like from the perspective of the man who owned it. The tension between these two forms of expertise, one rooted in athletic knowledge, one in proprietorial vision, surfaced during a disagreement about the placement of a water feature on one of the back 9 holes. Mickelson's professional judgment was that the feature, as Trump wanted, it would create a penalty that was unfair in the technical sense, that it would catch shots that were not poorly struck, that it would punish luck rather than bad play, that it would frustrate golfers in a way that eroded rather than enhanced their experience of the course. Trump listened to this argument with the patient attention of a man who has decided in advance that he is not going to be persuaded by it. Then he described, with a specificity that surprised Mickelson, exactly how the water feature would look from the terrace of the clubhouse during a member-guest tournament, exactly how the light would catch it in the late afternoon, exactly the visual impact it would create for the people watching from above. The hole was built as Trump had specified. The water feature went where Trump had said it should go. And the view from the clubhouse terrace was, by most accounts of people who have stood there, exactly as he had described it. What this revealed was not stubbornness in any simple sense. He was capable of updating his positions when the evidence warranted it. And there were design decisions at multiple properties where he deferred to the expertise of course architects whose visual intelligence he respected. What it revealed was the hierarchy of values that organized his decision-making. Above performance, above technical correctness, above the judgment of experts, sat the image. The course had to look like what a golf course should look like in the imagination of the person who was going to write the check to belong to it. It had to photograph well. It had to create, from the vantage points that mattered most, the clubhouse terrace, the first tee, the approach to the signature hole, an experience of beauty and scale that confirmed in the member's private accounting that the money had been well spent. This was not vanity, or not merely vanity. It was a genuine theory of value creation, and it was correct in the specific market Trump was serving. The members who joined Trump National Bedminster, or Trump National Westchester, or Trump National Los Angeles were not primarily scratch golfers who required technically perfect course design. They were successful people who wanted to belong to something that looked and felt like the most successful thing available. And Trump understood their desire because he shared it, had always shared it, had organized his entire commercial life around the gap between what a thing actually was and what it could be made to appear to be, and the revenue that gap could generate. Eric Trump had begun, during this period, to assume a role in the golf operations that went beyond ceremonial family involvement. He was in his early 20s when the Bedminster property was developing, a young man of earnest temperament and genuine affection for the business, who was absorbing, through proximity and direct participation, the operating principles of his father's approach to the courses. He traveled to properties. He attended design meetings. He developed relationships with course superintendents and membership directors and the local officials, whose cooperation was required for permits and approvals. He was not, in these early years, the senior executive he would eventually become. That authority was still entirely his father's, and no one in the Trump organization was confused about where the final decisions resided. But he was learning the business in the specific way that Trump businesses required it to be learned, by watching the man who ran it and understanding that the standards he applied were not negotiable and were not always explicable in conventional business terms, but were always, in retrospect, traceable to the same underlying principle. The course had to be the best. Best was defined by Trump. And the definition, however subjective it might appear to outsiders, was applied with a consistency that the people who worked for him eventually internalized as simply the way things were. By the mid-2000s, the Trump golf portfolio had grown to include properties in New Jersey, New York, California, Florida, and Virginia, with international acquisitions in the United Kingdom. The Turnberry Resort in Scotland, with its legendary links course on the Ayrshire coast, would be acquired in 2014, beginning to come into view on the horizon. The brand had achieved, within the specific community of high-net-worth golfers and golf real estate buyers, a recognition and a premium positioning that translated directly into membership fees and real estate prices. A Trump national address on a golf home carried a markup over comparable properties without the affiliation, and the markup was not trivial. Members paid initiation fees that reflected not merely access to the course, but association with the name. The same calculation that drove the residential licensing model applied now to a sporting and social context. The television show was feeding all of it. The Apprentice, running through its early seasons to the enormous audiences that had greeted its premiere, was performing a service for the golf business that no marketing budget could have replicated. It was delivering, each Thursday evening, a portrait of Trump as authority figure and business genius to exactly the demographic that could afford a Trump national membership. The synergy was not accidental. Trump understood it clearly, and the golf properties featured periodically in Apprentice episodes as locations for challenges and reward experiences in ways that blurred the line between entertainment and advertising with a seamlessness that the Federal Communications Commission had not yet developed adequate vocabulary to address. He was selling the show to the golf members and the golf clubs to the show's audience, and the two channels of promotion reinforced each other in a loop that was, for the better part of a decade, extraordinarily effective. What no one in the organization was discussing, or at least not discussing in terms that reached Trump's attention in a form he was willing to engage with, was the exposure that this integration created. The golf brand, and the television brand, and the real estate licensing brand had become so thoroughly intertwined, so mutually dependent for their collective elevation, that a serious problem in any one of them would travel with unusual speed into the others. The name that appeared on the Bedminster Clubhouse, and on the boardroom wall, and on the residential towers in Sunny Isles Beach was a single name, and its value in each context depended partly on its value in all the others. And the political identity that was slowly, almost invisibly, accreting around that name, the positions staked out in the America We Deserve, the Reform Party flirtation, the television persona of the ultimate authority who fired people without sentiment or apology, was becoming part of the brand's meaning whether the golf members wanted it to be or not. And the question of whether that political identity would eventually be an asset or a liability was one that the fairways of Bedminster, for all their beauty, could not answer. Chapter 44. Palm Beach High Society. The tent had been erected on the south lawn of Mar-a-Lago, with the kind of precision that Trump applied to all physical environments he controlled. The proportions calculated to accommodate 500 guests without creating the impression of a crowd. The ceiling height sufficient to suggest grandeur without sacrificing the intimacy that a wedding reception, even one of this scale, nominally required. It was the evening of January 22, 2005, and the temperature on the Palm Beach waterfront had dropped to something approaching pleasant, which in January in Florida constituted a meteorological gift that Trump accepted as appropriate to the occasion. The flowers were white and pale and everywhere. Roses and hydrangeas and orchids in quantities that required their own logistical operation, and the cake, designed by Sylvia Weinstock, stood nearly 5 feet and was covered in white fondant and sugar flowers and had been transported from New York with the same care applied to structural components of buildings Trump considered important. He moved through the reception with Melania, who wore a Christian Dior gown that John Galliano had designed with a 13-foot train, and that had required months of fitting and construction, and that communicated in the specific language of haute couture that whatever this was, it was not an ordinary wedding. Trump had seen to that. Every element of the evening had been assessed for its communicative function before its aesthetic one, and the assessment had concluded correctly that the aesthetic function and the communicative one were on this occasion inseparable. Palm Beach, in 2005, occupied a specific and somewhat paradoxical position in the American social geography. It was, on one level, the most traditional of American plutocratic enclaves, the island town across the causeway from West Palm Beach, where old money had been consolidating and recirculating since Henry Flagler extended his railroad down the Florida coast in the 1890s and built the hotels that made the winter migration of northern wealth into a social institution. The Bath and Tennis Club and the Everglades Club, the two institutions that most precisely defined Palm Beach social standing in its traditional configuration, operated on membership criteria that were explicitly about lineage and implicitly about the specific ethnic and religious exclusions that American WASP society had maintained through most of the 20th century, with a complacency that the post-war decades had only partially eroded. But Palm Beach in 2005 was also, increasingly, something else, a destination for the new money of the hedge fund era, the private equity fortunes, the technology wealth that had survived the dot-com correction, and was now looking for the kind of physical permanence that a Palm Beach estate represented. These two populations, the old guard of the established clubs and the new arrivals with their different backgrounds and their larger fortunes and their impatience with the social hierarchies that had excluded people like them, existed in a state of productive tension that Trump had understood and exploited since he acquired Mar-a-Lago in 1985. The estate itself was the key to understanding Trump's Palm Beach position. He had purchased the Marjorie Merriweather Post property, 17 acres on the island's southern end. The main house, a 118-room Hispano-Moresque confection that Post had spent millions constructing in the 1920s, and that the National Park Service had briefly considered as a presidential retreat before declining it, for approximately $8 million after a protracted negotiation with the Post Foundation that Trump had managed with characteristic patience and strategic ingenuity, including a period during which he purchased the beachfront directly to Mar-a-Lago's east and made clear that he could, if he chose, develop it in ways that would compromise the estate's value and the foundation's asking price. He had initially attempted to convert it to a private residence, then concluded that the carrying costs of a 118-room house exceeded the practical utility of a 118-room house, and converted it instead into a private club in 1995, charging an initiation fee that he set, revised upward and revised upward again as the club's profile grew in a sequence that was simultaneously a revenue optimization and a brand management exercise. Mar-a-Lago's membership, from the beginning of the club era, was open to people the established Palm Beach clubs excluded. The initiation fee was the only criterion. This was not, or not only, a principled stand against discrimination. It was also a market insight, an understanding that the excluded population included many of the wealthiest people in the country, and that a club that welcomed them would have no difficulty finding members willing to pay for the privilege. The wedding reception was therefore taking place in a setting that was itself an argument about Trump's position in the Palm Beach social order, about the relationship between old money and new money, about whether the most valuable social credential in an American plutocratic enclave was the approval of the established institutions or the ability to create your own institution and make it the place where everyone wanted to be. The guest list that evening reflected the resolution of that argument in Trump's favor. Political figures of both parties, entertainment figures of genuine celebrity, business figures whose net worth exceeded that of most of the old Palm Beach families whose clubs they had never been invited to join, and a selection of the traditional Palm Beach establishment who had arrived at Mar-a-Lago under the implicit understanding that the social geography of the island had shifted and that attendance at the Trump wedding was now, whatever their private reservations, the more strategically advantageous option. The core conflict of the Mar-a-Lago period, the years between the club's opening in 1995 and the mid-2000s peak of Trump's television celebrity, was the conflict between acceptance and creation, between the desire to be recognized by the existing social order and the impulse to construct a parallel one. Trump had, throughout his career, felt the specific friction of the excluded outsider, not economically excluded, because his resources had been sufficient to purchase access to most of what money could purchase, but socially excluded in the more granular sense, the sense in which certain rooms remained closed not because of the price of admission, but because of judgments about taste and lineage and the particular quality of person one was understood to be. The Midtown real estate establishment had made this judgment in the 1970s. The Palm Beach establishment had made it in the 1980s and 1990s. The New York social establishment, despite his tabloid visibility and his Midtown monuments, had never fully extended the embrace that would have indicated genuine acceptance into its inner precincts. Trump's response to this pattern, and it was a consistent response across multiple iterations, was not to seek acceptance through the accommodation of the excluding institution's criteria, but to construct a competing institution whose criteria he set and whose prestige he then built to the point where exclusion from it became the more socially costly position. The revealing action of the Mar-a-Lago period is a decision about membership pricing that Trump made and remade over the course of a decade, and that illuminates something essential about his understanding of the relationship between price and value. When Mar-a-Lago opened as a club in 1995, the initiation fee was set at $50,000, a figure that Trump had determined through his own assessment rather than formal market research was sufficient to create an exclusive membership while remaining accessible to the range of new money wealth that he was targeting. Over the following years, as the club's social profile grew and the waiting list for membership extended, he raised the fee repeatedly to $75,000 to $100,000, eventually to higher figures that tracked not the club's operating costs, but its social cachet, its desirability, the degree to which membership had come to signify something about the member's status that transcended the specific amenities the club provided. Each increase was announced rather than quietly implemented, made known to existing members and the broader social world in ways that communicated momentum, that suggested the club was becoming more valuable rather than merely more expensive. Trump understood, with the intuitive precision of someone who had been thinking about the semiotics of luxury his entire professional life, that price in certain markets functions not as a barrier to entry but as a signal of value, that raising the initiation fee of a social club did not reduce the demand for membership but increased it, because the people who wanted to join Mar-a-Lago were people for whom a higher price was itself part of what they were purchasing. The figure who most shaped Trump's social navigation of the Palm Beach world, and who represents the supporting pulse of this particular period, was Blaine Trump, his sister-in-law, during the Ivana years, who had remained a figure in the New York and Palm Beach social worlds after the divorce, and whose continued engagement with Trump illustrated something about the durability of his social relationships when they were built on genuine affection rather than purely transactional foundations. More centrally to the Mar-a-Lago story was the network of relationships Trump cultivated through the club with the class of mega donors and Republican political figures who were beginning, in the early 2000s, to use the property as an informal gathering space. The club hosted charitable galas, the Red Cross Ball, various Palm Beach philanthropic events that brought to its grounds the full cross-section of the island's social world, old money and new, and that gave Trump a recurring platform as host, a role that suited him with a naturalness that his other social roles, guest, attendee, donor, did not quite achieve. As host of Mar-a-Lago, he was in his native element, the owner of the space, the creator of the occasion, the person whose judgment had made the evening possible, and whose approval was, at least implicitly, the thing the guests were seeking by their presence. The marriage to Melania deepened this dynamic by providing the domestic architecture that the club's social operation had previously lacked. A married Trump with a wife of Melania's bearing and background was a different social proposition than a twice-divorced Trump in the first years of the club's operation, more legible within the conventions of the Palm Beach social season, which despite its evolution retained enough of its traditional form to value the couple as the fundamental social unit. Melania's comfort within Mar-a-Lago's social world was genuine rather than performed. She had the European facility with the formal social occasion, the ability to engage with the full range of the guest list without appearing to prefer any portion of it, that made her an effective partner in the hosting function that Trump required. Their first year of marriage coincided with the peak of the Apprentice's initial cultural dominance, which meant that Mar-a-Lago, in the winter of 2005 and 2006, was receiving guests who had spent the previous week watching Trump on national television, guests for whom the club and the man were now embedded in a double context, the social and the televisual, that reinforced each other in ways that amplified both. The birth of their son Barron in March of 2006 added a further dimension to the Palm Beach chapter, a domestic fact that Trump referenced in interviews and that altered, at least in the public presentation, the character of his engagement with the club and the season. He was, in his mid-50s, a father of young children again, a circumstance that he accommodated without appearing to find it discordant with the rest of the life he was living. Barron was incorporated into the Mar-a-Lago social world the way other elements of Trump's life were incorporated, visibly on occasions that served the larger narrative, and with the implicit message that the life Trump was living was complete and coherent, that all its components, the club, the television show, the buildings, the marriage, the new child, formed a unified argument about success of a specific and total kind. By the end of the first decade of the 2000s, Mar-a-Lago had achieved something that Trump had not entirely planned for and had not fully anticipated in its implications. It had become a political venue. The density of Republican donor wealth in its membership, the visibility of the property in the national media, the hosting infrastructure that Trump had spent a decade building, all of these made Mar-a-Lago a natural gathering point for the political conversations that serious money conducts at a remove from the formal structures of party committees and campaign headquarters. Figures who would matter enormously in Republican politics a decade hence were moving through the property's dining rooms and walking its grounds in conversations that were social in form and strategic in content. And Trump was present for many of these conversations, not as a political figure but as the host, listening, engaging, absorbing the dynamics of a world whose formal mechanisms he had explored once and retreated from, but had never stopped observing, and whose attention was now coming to him rather than requiring him to go looking for it, which was, in Trump's experience of most things that mattered, the condition under which the most significant developments in his life had always begun. Chapter 45. High-pressure sales. The seminar room smelled of new carpet and ambition, which in the Economy Hotel conference centers where Trump University held its free introductory sessions were essentially the same smell. The chairs were arranged in rows facing a projection screen, and on the screen was a photograph of Donald Trump, the Trump of the Apprentice, the Trump of the boardroom, and the pointed finger, and the 2 decades of tabloid mythology. And beneath the photograph, in the topography of aspiration, words about wealth and real estate and the secrets that separated the successful from everyone else. The people filling those chairs in cities across America in the mid-2000s were not, for the most part, the affluent buyers who purchased Trump national memberships or the international investors who put deposits on licensed tower apartments. They were school teachers and nurses and small business owners and retired couples who had watched the housing market perform miracles for people they knew and had concluded, with the particular urgency of people who feel time running out, that real estate was the mechanism by which their lives could be materially transformed. They came to the free session because it was free, and they stayed because the presentation was skillfully constructed to make leaving feel like a choice against their own futures. At the back of the room, in most cases invisible to the participants, was a system, a training manual, a script, a set of sales techniques refined through iteration, designed not to educate them but to identify which among them could be persuaded to spend more money than they had planned to spend before they walked through the door. Trump University had been conceived in 2004 as a natural extension of the brand architecture that the Apprentice was simultaneously constructing at national scale. The logic was straightforward, and, in its initial formulation, not unreasonable. Trump was a man who had built a real estate empire, or rebuilt one, and there was a genuine market for instruction in the principles that had governed that building. The education business had been booming for years on the strength of exactly this kind of celebrity expertise transfer. Think and Grow Rich seminars, motivational speakers filling convention centers, self-help curricula promising to translate the methods of the successful into accessible frameworks for the aspiring. The model was proven. The audience was enormous. And Trump possessed in The Apprentice a weekly advertisement for his own business acumen that reached 20 million households. The alignment of these facts was, from a pure business development standpoint, almost too obvious to require analysis. What required analysis, and received by most accounts insufficient of it, was the execution. The America in which Trump University operated between 2005 and 2010 was living through the most dramatic real estate appreciation in the country's history, followed by the most dramatic real estate collapse. The housing bubble that the Federal Reserve's low interest rate policy of the early 2000s had inflated to dimensions that even its skeptics had difficulty fully crediting was, through the middle years of the decade, still expanding, still producing stories of ordinary people who had bought modestly and sold magnificently, still generating the specific social proof. The neighbor who flipped a house and paid off his car, the cousin who got into rental properties and stopped going to work, that persuaded millions of Americans that real estate was the closest thing to a guaranteed mechanism for wealth creation that a market economy permitted. Into this environment, Trump University arrived with the authority of the Trump name and the promise of insider knowledge, not merely the general principles of real estate investment which were available in any library, but the specific techniques that Trump himself employed, the secrets of the deal that had built the towers and the golf courses, and the brand that America watched on television every Thursday night. The core conflict that defines this chapter is not, despite its eventual legal resolution, primarily a conflict between Trump and his students or between Trump and the regulators who would eventually come for him. It is a conflict between two versions of what Trump University could have been, between the legitimate education business that the concept, properly executed, might have constituted, and the high-pressure sales operation that it became in practice. And the conflict was never resolved in favor of the first version because the incentives at every level of the organization pointed toward the second. The instructors were paid on commission. The metrics by which the operation's success was measured were not student outcomes, not the real estate deals made, the properties purchased, the wealth created by the curriculum, but enrollment numbers and upsell rates, the percentage of free seminar attendees who purchased the basic 3-day course, and the percentage of those who could be persuaded to upgrade to the elite mentorship program, which carried a price tag of $35,000. When the incentives were structured this way, the educational content became instrumental, not the product, but the vehicle for the sale of the next level of product. And the sales techniques that the instructors were trained to use reflected this instrumental relationship with an explicitness that would, when the training manuals became public through litigation discovery, strike many readers as breathtaking in its candor about its own purposes. The playbook instructed instructors to identify the financial situation of each prospective student, specifically their available credit, early in the engagement, and to structure the pitch for the elite programs around whatever credit ceiling that identification revealed. Students were encouraged to call their credit card companies during breaks to raise their limits. The emotional architecture of the sales pitch moved systematically through aspiration and urgency and social proof and scarcity, the classic sequence of influence techniques that behavioral economists had been documenting for decades, applied here with a precision that suggested careful study of the literature. Testimonials from satisfied students were deployed strategically. The photograph of Trump, whose actual involvement in the curriculum design and instruction was, the evidence later showed, minimal, was present throughout, a constant invocation of the authority that was being sold as the essential ingredient in the product. The anecdote that most completely illuminates the character of the enterprise, and through it, something essential about Trump's relationship with the gap between brand promise and operational reality, involves the Trump University Playbook's instructions regarding a specific sales moment that the training materials called the turn. The turn was the pivot from educational content to sales pitch, the moment when the instructor transitioned from teaching real estate principles to selling the next level of the program, and the manual's guidance on how to execute it was notable for its explicit acknowledgement that students would experience resistance at this moment, that the price point would produce hesitation, and that the instructor's job was to reframe that hesitation not as a legitimate financial concern, but as evidence of the limiting beliefs that had prevented the student from achieving wealth in the first place. In other words, the sales technique weaponized the student's aspiration against their own prudence. To hesitate was to be the person you came here to stop being. The turn was, in its operational design, a manipulation of precisely the psychology that had brought these people into the room, their desire to change their lives, their fear that caution was indistinguishable from failure, and it was documented in writing and taught systematically to every instructor in the program. Trump's relationship to this operational reality is the most contested and, ultimately, the most revealing question the enterprise poses about his character. The legal settlements. He paid $25 million to resolve class action lawsuits and a New York Attorney General investigation in November 2016 without admitting wrongdoing. In the weeks immediately following his presidential election, do not resolve it. What the available evidence suggests is a man who was genuinely enthusiastic about the concept, who believed with apparent sincerity that the Trump name attached to a real estate education product was a legitimate value proposition, and who did not examine the operational details of how that value proposition was being sold with the attentiveness that the distance between the promise and the practice required. This is not the portrait of a man who sat in a room and designed a fraud. It is the portrait of a man whose brand was the product, who licensed it to operators, whose incentives he did not scrutinize, and who was shielded from the consequences of those operators' choices by layers of corporate structure and the general principle, which had served him reasonably well in the real estate licensing context, that the name's elevation was a shared interest and could therefore be trusted to produce aligned behavior without close supervision. The principle was wrong in the Trump University context in ways it had not been wrong, or at least not as visibly wrong, in the construction business, because the construction business produced buildings that either met their specifications or didn't, in ways that were observable and correctable, while the education business produced experiences and outcomes that were diffuse and subjective and far more difficult to audit from a distance. The figure whose role in this period most illuminates both the organization's internal culture and the failure mode that Trump University represented is Michael Sexton, the former McKinsey consultant who served as Trump University's president from its founding, and who was, in most operational senses, the man who built the institution and ran it day to day. Sexton was not a grifter in any simple sense. He was an educated, professionally credentialed executive who had persuaded himself, or been persuaded, that the program he was building was delivering genuine value to its students. He gave interviews in the program's early years that were earnest and specific about the curriculum's merits. He communicated with Trump about the enterprise's growth and progress with the enthusiasm of a man who believed in what he was doing. But Sexton was also the man who signed off on the sales training playbook, who oversaw the commission structures that aligned instructor incentives with enrollment rather than outcomes, who presided over an organization whose internal measurements tracked money extracted from students rather than knowledge delivered to them. The gap between his sincere belief in the product's value and the operational reality of how it was sold constituted in miniature the same gap that defined the enterprise as a whole, the gap between the brand promise and the thing the brand was actually delivering, which was not real estate education, but the sensation of proximity to Trump, sold at a price that the sensation, in most cases, could not justify. The lawsuits began arriving in 2010, filed by former students who described experiences that matched the playbook's design with uncomfortable precision. The free seminar that delivered no usable content but sold the 3-day course. The 3-day course that delivered no usable content but sold the elite mentorship. The elite mentorship that delivered instructors of no particular real estate expertise at a price of $35,000. The New York State Education Department had flagged the use of the word university in the program's name as early as 2005, noting that the term implied a degree-granting institution that Trump University was not and had never sought to be, and had required a name change that the organization eventually implemented. Slowly, incompletely, with the compliance posture of an entity that regarded regulatory requirements as negotiating positions rather than binding obligations. The Attorney General investigations in New York and California added a layer of governmental scrutiny that the private lawsuits alone had not produced. And the accumulation of plaintiff testimony, the retired couple who had put the elite mentorship on their credit cards and could not pay it off, the school teacher who had followed the playbook's instruction to call her credit card company from the seminar room and had raised her limit in order to enroll, began constructing a narrative that was, in its human specificity, considerably more damaging than any legal theory. Trump's public response to the litigation was to attack it with the same toolkit he applied to every adversarial situation. Deny, counterattack, question the motives of the accusers, assert the excellence of the product in terms whose confidence was calibrated to suggest that only someone with an ulterior agenda could question it. He gave interviews in which he described Trump University's student satisfaction surveys, which the organization had gathered, and which showed high immediate satisfaction rates, the way any experience shows high satisfaction rates immediately after the emotional investment required to justify it, as proof that the critics were wrong and the plaintiffs were motivated by something other than genuine grievance. He attacked the judges presiding over the cases with a directness that alarmed his own attorneys. He did not settle year after year, because settling would have been, in his accounting, an admission of the failure he refused to concede. The settlement that eventually came, in November 2016, arrived at the precise moment when the political calculation shifted, when the cost of an ongoing trial during a presidential transition outweighed the cost of writing a check, even a check of $25 million, and it arrived without the admission of wrongdoing that would have converted the financial resolution into the reputational one his critics wanted. What Trump University left in its wake was not merely a legal settlement and a community of aggrieved former students. It left something structural in the public record, a documented, detailed account of the distance between a Trump brand promise and the operational reality behind it, that was available for anyone who wished to consult it, as evidence about how the licensing model functioned when the licensor's attention was absent and the licensee's incentives were misaligned. The training manuals, the deposition testimony, the plaintiff declarations, the internal emails. They constituted an archive that journalists and political opponents had already begun to mine by the time the settlement was reached. And that archive would prove, in the political environment that Trump was about to enter with the full weight of his ambition, to be considerably more durable than any single news cycle, waiting patiently in the court record for the moment when the question of what Donald Trump's promises were actually worth became the most important question in American public life. Chapter 46. The galley proofs were spread across the conference table on the 26th floor of Trump Tower in the early weeks of 2004, and Trump was moving through them with a Sharpie in a manner that suggested less editing than archaeology, not revising the text so much as excavating from it the version that felt most completely like himself. Meredith McIver sat across from him with a legal pad, noting the changes, asking the occasional clarifying question, and performing the specific kind of attentive silence that the collaboration required of her. The pages that Trump had marked most heavily were the ones that dealt with money in the abstract, with the philosophy of wealth rather than its mechanics, because it was in those passages that the distance between what he actually believed and what the draft said was most legible to him. And the distance bothered him in the way that an imprecise specification bothers an architect. He did not want a book that described success. He wanted a book that transmitted it, that allowed the reader to feel, in the act of reading, the specific quality of attention and confidence that he associated with his own experience of the world. He crossed out a paragraph about patience. He wrote in the margin, faster. He moved on. The publishing landscape of 2004 was experiencing one of its periodic convulsions around a specific category of book that the industry found simultaneously easy to sell and difficult to take seriously: the celebrity business memoir, the self-help volume with a famous face on the cover, the product that lived in the overlap between the airport bookstore and the cultural conversation generated by a television hit. The Apprentice had premiered in January of that year, and its ratings had immediately altered the commercial calculus around anything connected to Trump's name. Publishers, who had been willing to offer reasonable advances for a Trump book before the show became a phenomenon, were, by the spring of 2004, willing to offer considerably more, because the show had done something that no previous Trump media project had accomplished. It had created a weekly, nationally distributed demonstration of the thesis that any Trump book would be required to argue. The boardroom, the firing, the authority, all of it was airing Thursday nights on NBC to 20+ million viewers, which meant that a book making the case for Trump's expertise as a business figure was not arguing against the reader's skepticism but with their recent experience. The show was the proof. The book was the elaboration. Random House, which published How to Get Rich in 2004, and Think Like a Billionaire later the same year, understood this dynamic with sufficient clarity to schedule both volumes for release within months of each other and within the first season of the show, a publishing cadence that was aggressive by conventional standards, but that reflected a correct assessment of the market conditions. A television hit generates a window, and the window closes, and the books that exist within the window benefit from conditions that books published before or after it do not enjoy. Trump, who had published The Art of the Deal in 1987 and watched it become a genuine bestseller through a combination of his own promotional energy and the cultural moment of the Reagan boom, understood the relationship between media environment and book sales with the practical precision of someone who had navigated it before. What was different in 2004 was the scale. The national television audience was an order of magnitude larger than the media platform that had supported The Art of the Deal, and the books that The Apprentice made possible would reach readers in markets and demographics that the 1980s Trump publishing had never penetrated. The core conflict that shaped the books of this period, and that the collaboration with McIver was specifically designed to navigate, was the tension between the authenticity the format required and the distance between Trump's actual daily engagement with his businesses and the omniscient authority that the books attributed to him. The celebrity business book, as a genre, makes an implicit promise to the reader that the famous person on the cover has, through their specific experience and specific intelligence, arrived at a set of insights that the reader does not yet possess, and that the purchase of the book will transfer. The promise requires that the author be legible as the source of those insights, that the voice on the page feel continuous with the person the reader already knows from other contexts, and that the specific advice or philosophy offered be traceable to actual decisions and actual outcomes that the author can claim. For Trump, whose actual daily business operation involved a management team, a legal infrastructure, and a licensing architecture that distributed decision-making across many people in ways that a first-person business book was not equipped to acknowledge, this requirement created a structural challenge. The books needed to sound like him. They needed to reflect his genuine patterns of thought and speech. And they needed to present those patterns as a coherent system that a reader could extract and apply, which required a degree of systematization that Trump's actual thinking, which was associative and intuitive rather than sequential and methodical, did not naturally produce. This is where McIver's contribution was essential, and where the collaboration that produced these books was more creatively significant than the cover credit, which listed her as a collaborator on some volumes and omitted her from others, accurately conveyed. McIver had joined the Trump Organization as an in-house writer in the late 1990s, having come from a background in editorial work that had given her a facility with the craft of making other people's thoughts legible on the page. Her specific skill, the skill that made her valuable in the context of the Trump books, was the ability to listen to Trump speak in the free associative, anecdote-driven, superlative-saturated manner that was native to him, and to extract from that speaking the underlying structure that it contained but did not announce. Trump's oral communication had a logic to it that was not always visible in transcription, but that became apparent when you listened across multiple conversations for the patterns, the recurring themes, the consistent value judgments, the specific formulations that appeared again and again, and that indicated a genuine and settled belief rather than a position adopted for the occasion. McIver listened for these patterns and built the books around them, providing the scaffolding of chapter structure and argumentative progression within which Trump's authentic voice could function without requiring him to be something he was not, which was systematic. The revealing action of this period involves a specific editorial session that McIver has described in general terms in subsequent accounts, and that several people familiar with the Trump Organization's publishing operation have corroborated in its essential character. Trump, reviewing a chapter draft that dealt with the management of employees, specifically the question of how to evaluate performance and make dismissal decisions, had objected to a passage that McIver had written to soften what he had said in their sessions about the importance of acting quickly when someone was not performing. The draft had, in the manner of business book convention, added qualifications, suggestions that the manager consider the employee's overall record, consult with human resources, allow time for the performance to improve. Trump read these qualifications with visible impatience and crossed them out with the Sharpie. The principle, as he articulated it in the session that followed, was not complicated. You know quickly whether someone is right for a job, and the longer you wait after you know, the more damage you do, to the organization, to the person, to yourself. The qualifications were not false exactly, but they were not the point, and putting them in the book made the book say something different from what he actually believed, which was that decisiveness was not cruelty but efficiency, that the merciful thing and the correct thing were the same thing and were both served by speed. McIver took the notes. The qualifications came out. The chapter that resulted was sharper and more specifically Trump than the draft had been, and the revision illustrated the collaboration's essential dynamic. McIver provided structure, Trump provided the conviction that gave the structure meaning, and the resulting text was more authentically his than anything the conventional ghostwriting process, in which the subject's voice is approximated rather than excavated, typically produced. The book sold. How to Get Rich reached the New York Times bestseller list within weeks of publication and remained there for months. Think Like a Billionaire followed a similar trajectory. The combined sales figures across the two volumes, supplemented by the ancillary revenues from audio editions, international rights sales, and the corporate bulk purchases that business books with famous authors reliably generate, represented a publishing success that was not merely commercial but structurally important to the Trump brand project. The books extended the boardroom persona into a format that was permanent and portable in ways that television was not, that a viewer could carry home, annotate, give to a colleague, reference in a conversation, return to over years in ways that a television episode, however widely watched, could not sustain. They also reached a demographic that television reached less efficiently: the business reader, the aspiring entrepreneur, the mid-career professional who was less likely to watch The Apprentice as appointment television, but who might purchase a Trump book at an airport and read it on a flight and arrive at their destination with a set of impressions about Trump's intelligence and competence that the show's theatrical format, however effective, could not as precisely calibrate. The figure in Trump's life who most shaped the trajectory of the publishing operation, not in the editorial sense, which was McIver's domain, but in the strategic sense, was his longtime assistant, Rona Graff, whose management of Trump's schedule and communications during this period gave her a comprehensive view of the publishing enterprise that no one else in the organization possessed. Graff had been with Trump since 1987, which meant she had been present for the art of the deal and for every subsequent publishing venture, and her institutional knowledge of how Trump's media projects were developed, timed, and deployed was encyclopedic. Her role in the book publishing operation was not creative, but logistical and relational, managing the publisher contacts, scheduling the promotional appearances, coordinating the book tour stops with the television schedule, and the real estate calendar in a way that maximized the efficiency of Trump's time without creating the conflicts between competing demands that an uncoordinated schedule would have generated. She was also, in the more personal register, one of the people in Trump's immediate world who could give him an honest assessment of whether a publicity plan was working or whether a particular media appearance had gone well, because her position inside the organization, long tenured, trusted, gave her both the access and the standing to offer observations that more peripheral figures could not risk providing. The publishing success of 2004 also opened a conversation about Trump's authority as an intellectual, or rather, as a practitioner with insights transferable to others, that had not previously been part of his public positioning. The Art of the Deal had made a version of this argument in 1987, but the 1987 book had appeared in a context where Trump was primarily a New York story, where the national readership encountered it as an artifact of a specific and somewhat exotic world rather than as a guide to principles they could apply in their own lives. The 2004 books appeared in a context where 20 million people had spent weeks watching Trump evaluate and dismiss contestants in a format designed to make his business judgment legible at the consumer level. The books that appeared in that context were not processed as exotic artifacts. They were processed as instruction, as access to a system that the reader had already seen demonstrated on television and now wanted to understand at the level of principle. This represented a qualitative shift in Trump's cultural position, from celebrity to authority, from famous person to person whose famousness was understood to derive from specific expertise that others could benefit from. What the books could not fully anticipate, and what neither Trump nor McIver nor the publishers had reason to consider in the commercial optimism of 2004, was that the authority they were constructing in print would eventually be evaluated in an arena where the standards of verification were considerably more rigorous than those applied to airport business books, where the claim to business expertise would be assessed not by readers disposed to believe it, but by investigators, journalists, and political opponents disposed to test it against the documentary record, and where the gap between the persona the books had constructed and the operational reality they had selectively represented would become not a publishing question but a political one, with consequences that extended well beyond any bestseller list. Chapter 47. Wealth Co-Branding. They met for lunch at Jean Georges, the restaurant on the ground floor of the Trump International Hotel and Tower on Central Park West, and the choice of venue was not incidental. Trump always chose his own rooms when he could, which was almost always, and the particular room he chose communicated something specific about the terms on which the meeting was being conducted. Jean Georges Vongerichten's restaurant occupied the building's base with the quiet authority of a four-star establishment that happened to be inside a Trump property, and the combination, the chef's impeccable reputation laundering the address lending the chef's reputation a particular New York glamour, was itself a model of the co-branding logic that Trump had been developing and refining across a decade of licensing agreements and celebrity partnerships. When Robert Kiyosaki arrived, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the most successful personal finance publishing phenomenon of the preceding decade, Trump was already at the table, already ordering, already in the posture of a man receiving a guest in his own house. Kiyosaki, who was not easily impressed, he had sold over 26 million copies of his book and had built a financial education empire of his own, and he understood the architecture of wealth celebrity from the inside, recognized the performance immediately and appreciated it, because he was running the same kind of operation and admired the craftsmanship. Two men, who had each made themselves into brands, sat down to discuss what a brand could accomplish when it collaborated with another brand, and the lunch lasted 3 hours. The collaboration that emerged from that meeting and subsequent conversations, a series of co-authored books beginning with Why We Want You to Be Rich, published in 2006, followed by Midas Touch in 2011, was in many respects the purest expression of the co-branding logic that Trump had been pursuing since the bankruptcy years had forced him to understand that the name was the asset. With the golf courses and the residential towers, the name attached to physical objects that could be photographed and visited and evaluated against their promise. With Trump University, the name had attached to an educational experience whose quality could be disputed and whose delivery could be scrutinized. With Kiyosaki, the name attached to ideas, to propositions about wealth and its creation, to a philosophy of financial independence packaged in the language of accessible self-improvement. And ideas were, of all the things a name could attach itself to, the most frictionless and the most scalable. A book could be printed in unlimited quantities. It required no construction permits, no environmental remediation, no community board approval, no debt service. It could be translated into 30 languages and sold in airports in 40 countries and generate royalties indefinitely. And if the ideas in the book were sufficiently general, if they operated at the level of principle rather than specific instruction, at the level of mindset rather than technique, they could never be precisely evaluated against outcomes in the way that a golf course could be walked or an apartment could be appraised. The mid-2000s were the high water mark of a specific American cultural formation that both Trump and Kiyosaki had helped to create, and from which both continued to draw enormous sustenance. The self-help industrial complex, the publishing category, the seminar circuit, the infomercial ecosystem, the motivational speaker network, had been building since the 1970s and had reached, in the years of the housing boom, a particular intensity of public appetite. The message that resonated most powerfully in this environment was not the message of caution or complexity. It was the message of access, the idea that the financial strategies of the wealthy were not structurally unavailable to ordinary people, but had simply not been explained to them in the right language, by the right messengers in the right context. Rich Dad, Poor Dad had been the decade's most successful delivery vehicle for this message. Kiyosaki's central thesis, that the financially literate thought differently about assets and liabilities than the financially struggling, was packaged in a narrative so simple and so emotionally resonant that it had crossed from the personal finance shelf into the mainstream reading culture in a way that few books in the category had managed. Trump, whose own Art of the Deal had performed a similar function in the 1980s, recognized in Kiyosaki a structural peer, a man who had understood that the real product was not information but identity, not knowledge but the feeling of access to knowledge that changed everything. The conflict that shaped this collaboration was not between the two men. Their relationship, from its earliest meetings, was characterized by a mutual recognition and a complementary vanity that made friction largely unnecessary, but between what the collaboration was and what it was publicly presented to be. The books were marketed as the genuine intellectual product of two successful men sharing their accumulated wisdom about wealth creation, the distilled essence of decades of deal-making and financial innovation. What they were, more precisely, was a co-branding exercise in which two names with established constituencies were combined to produce an audience larger than either could command independently. And the content was constructed to serve that audience's desire for confirmation and aspiration rather than its need for practical instruction. This was not, in the literary sense, dishonest. Both men had genuinely built wealth and had genuinely thought about how they had done it. And some of what the books contained reflected that thinking with reasonable accuracy. But the framing, the implicit promise that proximity to Trump's name and Kiyosaki's philosophy constituted a meaningful transfer of financial capability, was operating in the same register as every other product in the wealth education industry, a register where the line between inspiration and exploitation was drawn by the consumer's ability to maintain critical distance from material specifically designed to dissolve it. Trump's contribution to Why We Want You to Be Rich was, by the accounts of people involved in the project's production, largely the contribution of his presence and his perspective rather than his sentence-level writing. His sections of the book had the voice of the man himself, blunt, confident, populated with examples from his own career that were accurate in their broad outlines and somewhat expansive in their specific details. And they served the book's core purpose, which was to give readers the sensation of receiving personal counsel from a man whose financial life they recognized from television and tabloids and the skylines of American cities. He told stories about deals. He described the mindset of the successful in terms that were accessible and flattering to the reader's self-image. He argued for risk-taking and against the timidity of conventional financial planning with the enthusiasm of a man who had taken enormous risks and from the vantage point of the mid-2000s could point to a portfolio of golf courses and branded towers as vindication. The anecdote that serves as the clearest window into Trump's approach to the collaboration and into the broader logic of his publishing ventures, involves a disagreement with the book's editors at Currency Doubleday about the level of specificity that the financial advice sections should contain. The editors, operating under the standard professional obligations of a publishing house that did not want to be liable for financial guidance that readers might follow into loss, pushed for caveats, for the kind of qualifying language that distinguished general philosophical orientation from specific investment recommendation. Trump's response was not to engage with the legal or ethical logic of the request. It was to observe, with the directness he brought to all such negotiations, that the caveats undermined the product. People did not pay for a book by Donald Trump because they wanted to be told that results might vary and that past performance was no guarantee of future outcomes. They paid for the confidence. The caveats were what a cautious man put in a book. And Trump was not a cautious man and was not selling caution. And a book that hedged its promises was a book that failed its reader by giving them less than they had come for. The editors absorbed this argument with the professional equanimity of people who had worked with difficult authors before. and the final text struck a balance that, in the estimation of the people who negotiated it, landed somewhere between Trump's preferred confidence and the publishing house's preferred prudence, closer on inspection to Trump's position than to the publisher's. Robert Kiyosaki was, in the dynamic of the partnership, the more intellectually systematic of the two, the man who had built an actual pedagogical framework. However contested some of its specific claims were among credentialed economists around a coherent theory of financial education. He had written a book that, whatever its limitations, had been structured as an argument with a thesis and evidence and a progression of ideas that built on each other. He brought to the collaboration a genuine enthusiasm for the subject matter that was, in its way, distinct from Trump's enthusiasm, which was primarily for the outcome, the wealth, rather than the intellectual structure of how one got there. Kiyosaki thought about financial literacy as a cultural problem, a failure of education systems that left people without the conceptual tools to manage their own economic lives. Trump thought about wealth as a competitive arena in which some people won and others lost, and the winners were the ones who were willing to fight harder and think bigger and take the risks that the cautious declined. These were not incompatible perspectives, and in the better sections of the books, they achieved a genuine synthesis. But they were different enough in their underlying orientation that the collaboration sometimes had the quality of two men talking about adjacent subjects in slightly different languages and agreeing that the translation was close enough. The book sold well, though not at the level of Kiyosaki's solo work. Why We Want You to Be Rich debuted on the New York Times bestseller list and remained there for several weeks, driven partly by the combined promotional firepower of two men who understood how to move units. The radio appearances, the speaking engagements, the mutual endorsement that each brought to the other's audience. The collaboration was presented publicly as a friendship, and there were genuine elements of mutual appreciation in it. But its primary character was commercial, a joint venture in which the product was the names themselves, and the content was the packaging the names required to be sold in bookstores. Trump understood this without embarrassment, because he had long since arrived at a position, refined through the licensing years, and the television years, and the Trump University years, that there was no meaningful distinction between commercial and intellectual activity when the name was the fundamental asset. The book existed to extend the name. The name's extension was the purpose. Everything else, the philosophy, the anecdotes, the advice, was the vehicle. What the Kiyosaki collaboration illuminates most clearly, in retrospect, is the degree to which Trump's entire post-bankruptcy business model was a single unified argument about the nature of value. The argument was this: that the perception of success was not merely correlated with actual success, but was, in many contexts, constitutive of it. That being seen as the most successful businessman in America made you, in practical economic terms, more successful, because people paid premiums to be associated with perceived success regardless of whether the underlying performance justified the premium. This was not a fraudulent proposition. It was a genuine insight about how markets for luxury and aspiration operated, and it was an insight that the licensing model, the television show, the golf courses, and the publishing ventures all exploited with coherent consistency. The problem, and it was a problem that the Kiyosaki collaboration embodied without resolving, was that the argument had limits that the boom years of the mid-2000s were obscuring with unusual efficiency. When the housing market was producing 20% annual returns, and the stock market was recovering from the dot-com correction, and the general atmosphere of American financial life was one of expanding possibility, the proposition that thinking like a rich person would make you rich was sustainable, because enough people who acted on it found the external environment validating their choices regardless of the quality of the advice. When the environment changed, when the market that had been making everyone who owned property look like a genius collapsed with a speed and completeness that the wealth education industry had not prepared its clients to anticipate. The distance between the promise and the reality would become measurable in ways that the seminar rooms and the bestseller lists had not permitted. The financial crisis of 2008 arrived like an audit of everything the wealth co-branding industry had been selling, and the audit's findings were uncomfortable for anyone whose business depended on the proposition that the right mindset was sufficient protection against structural economic catastrophe. Trump and Kiyosaki both navigated the crisis with their personal finances substantially intact. Trump because his capital-light licensing model had reduced his exposure to construction debt. Kiyosaki because his business was selling ideas about real estate rather than owning it. But their students and readers and seminar attendees were not so insulated, and the stories that began accumulating in the crisis's aftermath of people who had borrowed against their homes to fund Trump University enrollments or who had restructured their retirement savings around the real estate investment principles they had absorbed from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, would eventually constitute a different kind of audit, one conducted not in the language of economics, but in the language of human consequence. And that audit's findings were already being written in the lives of people who had trusted the names on the covers of the books as they sat in the ruins of a financial world that no one had adequately warned them about, trying to calculate how much they had lost and who was responsible and what, if anything, could be done about it. Questions whose political valence, in the hands of a man who understood how to channel popular anger with the precision of a musician who has spent a lifetime learning an instrument, would prove within the decade to be incalculable. Chapter 48. Cultivating the Base. The call to Fox News was placed from Trump's office on the 26th floor sometime in the late winter of 2011, and the person who took it on the other end understood, as everyone at Fox News had learned to understand about Trump calls, that the conversation would be short, declarative, and would arrive at its real content without the preliminary courtesies that most guests required. Trump had been making these calls with increasing frequency since the beginning of the year, to Fox and Friends in the mornings, to Sean Hannity's producers in the afternoons, to the general booking apparatus of a network that had discovered, through the reliable metric of ratings, that Trump segments generated a specific kind of viewer engagement that was difficult to achieve through conventional political commentary. He was not yet a candidate. He was not yet a declared anything. He was a television personality and a real estate developer who had, over the preceding months, begun saying on air something that a significant portion of the Fox News audience had been saying to each other since 2008. And that no figure of Trump's visibility had yet been willing to say in a format that the mainstream media could not ignore. The question of Barack Obama's birth certificate. Whether the document that had been released was authentic. Whether the President of the United States had been born in Kenya. Whether the whole architecture of his identity, his education, his citizenship, his legitimacy, whether all of it rested on a foundation that had never been properly examined. Trump leaned forward and began talking, and the producer on the other end of the line opened a segment slot. The America of 2010 and 2011 was in a specific and volatile condition that the political class, still processing the scale of Obama's 2008 victory, had not fully prepared itself to interpret. The financial crisis of 2008 had produced an economic trauma whose material consequences, the foreclosures, the unemployment, the retirement accounts diminished or destroyed, were distributed unevenly across the population in ways that the recovery, when it came, would also distribute unevenly. The Tea Party movement, which had emerged in 2009 as an organized expression of conservative populist anger at the bank bailouts and the stimulus and the Affordable Care Act, had by 2010 demonstrated its electoral force in the midterm elections, flipping the House and installing in the Republican caucus a cohort of members whose relationship to the party's establishment was explicitly adversarial. The movement's energy was real, and its grievances were, in significant part, economically rooted, but it also contained, in portions that varied by geography, and that the movement's most visible spokespersons were not always eager to quantify, a component of cultural and racial anxiety that the election of the first black president had activated and that the political system had not developed adequate language to address. The birther claim, the assertion that Obama's birth certificate was fraudulent, that he had been born outside the United States and was therefore constitutionally ineligible for the presidency, was not, in its origins, a Trump invention. It had circulated on the Internet since the 2008 campaign, had been promoted by a network of fringe websites and email chains, and had achieved a level of penetration in certain Republican demographics that polling organizations had been documenting since 2009 with a mixture of sociological interest and institutional alarm. What Trump understood, and what made his engagement with the birther claim categorically different from its previous circulation, was the difference between a belief held privately and a belief amplified by a platform. The claim had existed before he touched it. What it had lacked was a figure of sufficient mainstream visibility to carry it from the fringe into the center of the national conversation. Someone whose name recognition guaranteed coverage, whose television presence guaranteed repetition, and whose willingness to state the claim flatly and without the hedging qualifications that journalists expected from public figures guaranteed that each statement would be treated as news rather than noise. Trump provided all three of these things simultaneously. When he said on Fox News, or on the Today Show, or in a phone interview with a local radio station, that he had serious doubts about Obama's birth certificate, and that the people he had sent to Hawaii were finding things that were very surprising, the statement was covered, not because it was credible, but because he was prominent. And prominence in the American media system functions as a credentialing mechanism that is largely indifferent to the epistemic status of the claim being made. The core conflict of this period was one that Trump did not acknowledge publicly, and may not have fully articulated to himself privately. The conflict between what the birther engagement was doing for his political prospects and what it was doing to the credibility that those prospects would require. The short-term effects were unambiguous and measurable. His poll numbers among Republican primary voters, which had been marginal during the Reform Party exploration of 2000, and which had not significantly improved through the years of Apprentice celebrity, began to move in response to the birther coverage. A CNN poll in April of 2011 placed him at the top of a hypothetical Republican primary field. Conservative media figures, who had previously engaged with him primarily as a celebrity, were beginning to engage with him as a political figure. The audience that he was reaching through the Fox News appearances and the talk radio calls was the specific audience: older, white, culturally conservative, economically anxious, whose activation would be essential to any serious Republican presidential campaign. He was, without a formal campaign structure or a declared candidacy or a single dollar of campaign finance, building a political base through media appearances whose content was calibrated to the beliefs and anxieties of the audience he needed to reach. The long-term cost was less immediately visible. The birther claim was false, demonstrably, documentarily false, a claim that had been refuted by the state of Hawaii, by contemporaneous birth announcements in Honolulu newspapers, by the basic mechanics of American citizenship law. Engaging with it publicly, in the specific way that Trump engaged with it, not as a question worth examining, but as a suspicion he personally harbored and was publicly voicing, attached his political identity to a claim whose falsity would eventually require either abandonment or indefinite maintenance. It also attached his political identity, in the minds of observers who were not part of the conservative populist audience he was cultivating, to the specific strain of racial animus that critics argued was the claim's animating force, the refusal to accept the legitimacy of a black president, that the birth certificate question provided a procedural frame for expressing. Trump did not make this argument explicitly. He did not need to. The claim made it implicitly, and the audience that received it processed it in the register that the implicit argument addressed. The revealing action of the birther period is a press conference that Trump held at the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas in February of 2011, at which he spoke to reporters about his ongoing interest in the birth certificate question, and announced, with the delivery of a man sharing information rather than performing outrage, that he had dispatched investigators to Hawaii and that they were finding things that were very interesting. He declined to specify what things. He declined to identify the investigators. He declined to provide a timeline for the release of whatever the investigators had found. What he provided, instead, was the architecture of a disclosure without its content, the suggestion of evidence without evidence, the promise of revelation calibrated to sustain attention without requiring the revelation to actually occur. Several reporters in the room pressed him on the specifics. He was genial, unhurried, and entirely uninformative. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes, said almost nothing that could be verified or refuted, and generated a news cycle that ran for days. The investigators, to the extent that they existed as more than a rhetorical device, were never publicly identified. The things they found were never publicly specified. The press conference accomplished everything a press conference is capable of accomplishing: coverage, attention, the transmission of a message to a specific audience, without creating the evidentiary record that a substantive claim about a sitting president's citizenship would logically require. The figure who most shaped Trump's political engagement during this period was not a campaign professional or a political strategist. He had neither in any formal sense, but Roger Stone, whose long-standing relationship with Trump and whose intuitive grasp of the media political interface made him the closest thing to an architect that Trump's pre-campaign political activity possessed. Stone had been arguing for years that Trump's celebrity was a form of political capital that was being systematically underutilized, and the birther period represented, in Stone's reading of it, the first successful test of the hypothesis that Trump could generate political attention without political infrastructure, that the media platform he had built through The Apprentice and through decades of press cultivation was sufficient when pointed at a political target to produce effects that conventional politicians spent millions of dollars attempting to achieve. Stone was not in a formal advisory role during this period. He was in the informal role he preferred, present in the conversation, influential in the framing, and free of the accountability that a formal role would have required. His influence on Trump's political thinking during the birther period was real, but, as with most of Stone's influence on most of the people he worked with, difficult to trace with documentary precision because Stone operated most effectively in the register of suggestion rather than instruction. The White House's response, the release of the long-form birth certificate in April of 2011, which Obama announced at a press briefing with a quality of controlled exasperation that was itself a comment on the episode's absurdity, temporarily deflated the birther narrative as a media story. Obama's announcement was followed with a timing that Trump later described as coincidental, and that few observers accepted as such, by Trump's appearance at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Obama delivered a set of remarks about Trump that were, by the standard of presidential comedy, remarkably precise in their mockery, targeting not just the birther claim, but Trump's business record, his television show, and the specific quality of vanity that made him vulnerable to ridicule of this kind. Trump sat at his table in the Washington Hilton ballroom and received the jokes with a stillness that the cameras captured and that commentators read with varying degrees of confidence, as evidence of anger, humiliation, or the specific kind of cold storage that a man employs when he intends to respond to an insult at a time and in a manner of his own choosing rather than the insulter's. He declined to run in 2012. The announcement, made in May of 2011, was framed in the by now familiar language of reluctant withdrawal. The vehicle was inadequate. The timing was not right. The demands of his business were too significant to permit the commitment that a serious campaign required. The political press covered the withdrawal with the consensus interpretation that the exploratory period had been, from the beginning, a promotional exercise connected to the Celebrity Apprentice season then airing, and that the birth certificate's release had removed the primary media oxygen that the campaign trial balloon had been running on. This interpretation was not without foundation, but it also repeated the analytical error that observers had made about the 2000 Reform Party exploration. The assumption that because the candidacy had not materialized, the political engagement had been without consequence, that the audience Trump had reached, and the beliefs he had validated, and the political identity he had begun to construct were artifacts of a promotional exercise rather than investments in a future that he was not yet prepared to collect on. The birther period accomplished something that none of Trump's previous political engagements had accomplished. It gave him a specific political identity within a specific political community. He was no longer simply a celebrity who expressed opinions about politics. He was the figure who had said, loudly and repeatedly, and on the largest available platforms, what a significant portion of the Republican base had been saying quietly, who had absorbed the social risk of the claim so that its audience did not have to, and who had thereby created, with the efficiency that characterized his best media work, a bond of shared transgression that is one of the most durable forms of political loyalty. The people who had watched the Fox News segments and nodded, who had forwarded the news coverage to their contacts, who had felt that someone was finally saying it, those people did not forget, when the political conditions that Trump was waiting for finally materialized, that he had been the one willing to say it first. What no one in the political establishment, watching Trump absorb Obama's mockery at the correspondents' dinner, and then quietly withdraw from the 2012 race, adequately calculated, was the degree to which the withdrawal was strategic rather than conclusive. A recognition that 2012 was not the right cycle, not the right opponent, not the right conditions, rather than a genuine abandonment of the ambition that the previous months had made visible, and that the base he had assembled through the birther period was not dispersing but waiting, organized around no formal structure, but held together by the specific kind of grievance that political movements built on identity and legitimacy, rather than policy and program, can sustain across multiple election cycles without institutional support. Chapter 49. Global Franchise Expansion. The stakes arrived at the table on a wooden board, and Donald Trump looked at them with the proprietary satisfaction of a man examining something he has made, which in a meaningful commercial sense he had. They were thick-cut, well-marbled, presented with the theatrical confidence of a product that understood its audience, and the board bore his name in the same typeface that appeared on his towers and his golf courses and the corner of the television screen every Thursday night. He was at a promotional event in 2007, surrounded by cameras and journalists and the apparatus of a product launch, and he was saying, with the particular enthusiasm he brought to new ventures in their honeymoon phase, that these were the world's greatest stakes, that he had been involved personally in their development, that the quality was unmatched, and that anyone who tasted them would understand immediately why the Trump name was on the packaging. A reporter in the room noted quietly enough that the observation did not disrupt the event's momentum, that the stakes were being sold exclusively through the sharper image, a consumer electronics and novelty retailer whose core business was massage chairs and executive toys, not, in most culinary traditions, the expected retail partner for a premium beef product. Trump did not acknowledge the observation as the category mismatch it was. He held a piece of steak on a fork and looked into the nearest camera and said what he always said, what he had learned to say with a conviction that the cameras rewarded regardless of the evidence. It was the best. Trump Steaks was, in the candid assessment of anyone who examined its commercial structure without prior commitment to its success, a product that was not designed to build a sustainable business. It was designed to extend a name, to put the word Trump in superscript above a category of American life that had not yet been colonized by the brand, to demonstrate that the name's reach was not bounded by geography or product category or any of the conventional logic of brand extension that marketing professionals applied to less aggressive franchises. The stakes lasted approximately 2 years before the Sharper Images bankruptcy effectively ended the venture. They were followed into the market in rough succession by Trump Ice Bottled Water, Trump Home Furniture and Bedding and Lighting, sold through a licensing agreement with a manufacturing partner, Trump Fragrance, a line of colognes and perfumes whose names, Donald Trump the Fragrance, Empire, Success, had the quality of jokes that were entirely serious, and Trump Vodka, which was promoted with the argument that it would be the most successful vodka in the world, and which was discontinued in the United States within 3 years of its launch, though it found a secondary market in Israel that sustained it somewhat longer. To understand why this proliferation of consumer products made strategic sense, even as individual products failed commercially, one must understand the particular economics of celebrity brand licensing in the years of the Apprentice's peak cultural influence. The show was averaging, in its early seasons, between 15 and 20 million viewers per episode, and those viewers were receiving each week a sustained argument about Trump's business acumen and personal authority that no advertising campaign could have purchased at any price. The licensing fees that consumer product companies paid for the right to attach the Trump name to their products were, in the context of what they were receiving, access to that television audience's associative goodwill, the implicit endorsement of a man that 20 million Americans watched succeed at business every week, relatively modest. Trump's cost was the name itself, which cost him nothing in the marginal sense, and his benefit was twofold: the licensing revenue, which was real if not transformative, and the omnipresence, the sense that the Trump brand was everywhere, attached to everything, inescapable in the commercial landscape in a way that reinforced the television narrative and the real estate narrative and every other channel through which the name was generating value. The 2000s were the decade of the celebrity brand, and Trump was operating in a category that Paris Hilton and Jay-Z and a dozen other celebrities were simultaneously discovering and exploiting. The logic was simple and powerful. If a name carried cultural meaning, that meaning could be transferred to products, and the transfer generated value for both the name and the product. Hilton put her name on handbags and fragrances. Jay-Z built a spirits business around his celebrity, and eventually acquired stakes in companies that made him genuinely wealthy independent of his music. Martha Stewart had constructed an empire of domesticity so complete that her name on a towel or a lamp was a quality signal that retailers would pay to display. The difference between Trump's consumer product strategy and these peers was partly one of category coherence. Stewart's name meant something specific about domestic elegance that her products could deliver against, while Trump's name meant something more diffuse about success and masculinity and New York that was harder to translate into a consistent product experience, and partly one of attention. Stewart was deeply, personally involved in the quality of the products that bore her name, in ways that Trump, managing a global real estate licensing operation and filming a network television show simultaneously, was not and perhaps could not have been. The core conflict of this chapter is precisely this tension between the name's ambition and its attention. The licensing model that had proved so durable and so elegant in the real estate context, where Trump's genuine expertise allowed him to perform meaningful oversight even over properties he did not own, and where the products were expensive enough and durable enough that quality failures were visible and consequential, was significantly less well-suited to a consumer product portfolio scattered across categories he did not know intimately, sold through retail channels he had never operated in, at price points where the margin for failure was narrow and the feedback loop was short. A Trump-licensed residential tower that disappointed its buyers generated lawsuits that took years to resolve and could be managed, or at least survived, through legal strategy and brand resilience. A Trump-branded vodka that disappointed its buyers generated nothing more dramatic than a shelf clearance at the liquor store. But the accumulation of such disappointments, each one small, each one reported somewhere, each one available as evidence in a future argument about the gap between the Trump promise and the Trump product, was constructing something in the public record that the individual failures considered in isolation did not reveal. The anecdote that most clearly illuminates Trump's relationship with the consumer product expansion comes from the development of Trump Home, the furniture and bedding line that he launched in 2006 through a licensing arrangement with a manufacturer whose facilities he had visited exactly once during the negotiation of the agreement. The visit was, by accounts of people who accompanied him, a performance of interest rather than an exercise in due diligence. He walked the showroom floor, commented on specific pieces, made observations about quality and design that were knowledgeable enough in their surface register to satisfy the manufacturer's representatives, and concluded the visit without the kind of deep operational scrutiny that a man genuinely concerned with manufacturing standards would have conducted. What he focused on instead, with the intensity he brought to every version of this activity, was the showroom display, how the pieces would look together, how the name would appear on the packaging and the hang tags, how the visual language of the product line would communicate luxury in the retail environment where it would eventually compete. He redesigned the display arrangement during the visit, moving pieces, adjusting sight lines, instructing the manufacturer's team on how the presentation needed to change to communicate what the brand required it to communicate. He was doing what he always did, managing the image with precision and leaving the substance to people whose alignment of incentives he had not sufficiently verified. The furniture line achieved modest commercial success and was eventually discontinued when the licensing arrangement expired without renewal, not because of a dramatic failure, but because the quiet mediocrity of its performance could not justify the continuation of a name attachment that required at minimum the appearance of Trump-level quality. Ivanka Trump was, during this period, the figure within the organization who most clearly saw both the opportunity and the risk of the consumer product strategy, and whose own subsequent career would represent a more disciplined and commercially successful version of the celebrity brand extension that her father was pursuing with more enthusiasm than precision. She had joined the Trump Organization after graduating from the Wharton School of Business, and she brought to the family enterprise a combination of her father's instinct for image and a more methodical approach to brand coherence that reflected both her formal education and her generational distance from the improvisation that had characterized the organization's earlier decades. She was, by her mid-20s, managing significant real estate projects within the organization and developing her own sense of how a Trump brand extension should be structured, with a tighter relationship between the name and the product's actual quality, with more attention to the retail environment and consumer experience, with a clearer understanding of the target customer that allowed for more precise positioning. Her own eventual fashion and lifestyle brand would demonstrate that she had absorbed the lessons of the consumer product expansion's failures as carefully as she had absorbed the lessons of its logic. In the mid-2000s, she was watching her father's proliferation with the attentive respect of a younger executive who understood that the man at the top of the organization was also its most valuable asset and its most significant risk, and who was learning through observation which of his instincts to emulate and which to correct for. The international dimension of the consumer product expansion added a layer of complexity that the domestic ventures did not present. Trump's name carried different valences in different markets. In some international contexts, particularly in certain Middle Eastern and Asian markets where American luxury brands commanded aspirational premiums, the Trump Association communicated something powerfully positive about wealth and ambition, and a specifically American version of success. In others, particularly in European markets with more nuanced relationships to American commercial culture, the brand registered as excessive as the kind of gold-plated vulgarity that confirmed continental prejudices about American taste rather than challenging them. The fragrance line, which was distributed internationally through duty-free channels and specialty retailers, performed better in some markets than others in ways that followed these cultural fault lines with uncomfortable precision. The vodka, positioned against premium Russian and Scandinavian competitors, whose quality bona fides were rooted in geography and tradition that the Trump name could not replicate, found the international spirits market unreceptive in a way that the domestic celebrity brand logic had not predicted. By the early 2010s, as The Apprentice entered its later seasons with declining but still substantial ratings, and the real estate licensing business continued its international expansion into markets ranging from the Philippines to Azerbaijan, the consumer product portfolio had contracted from its mid-2000s peak. The stakes were gone. The vodka was effectively gone in the United States. The mortgage company, Trump Mortgage, which had launched in 2006, at the absolute peak of the housing bubble, with the specific unfortunate timing of a venture whose founder did not recognize that the conditions enabling it were about to reverse, had closed in 2007, a year after its launch, when the mortgage market it had entered ceased to exist in its previous form. The pattern of these departures was consistent and, in retrospect, diagnostic. Each venture had been entered with genuine enthusiasm and promotional energy. Each had been supported by the television platform that made Trump's name commercially magnetic. And each had exited the market not through a dramatic failure, but through a quiet inability to deliver at the product level what the name promised at the brand level. What the consumer product era ultimately demonstrated, its lasting contribution to the understanding of what the Trump brand actually was and what it could actually do, was that the name's power was conditional in ways that the real estate context had obscured. In real estate, the name's promise of luxury and success was evaluated against physical objects that cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and that required, by the nature of the purchase, careful evaluation. Buyers toured apartments and inspected finishes and compared competitors and made decisions over months, and the Trump name was one input among many. In consumer products, the name's promise was evaluated against objects that cost $40 or $100, that were purchased in minutes, and that were experienced immediately against expectations that the name had set. The gap between expectation and experience, in this compressed timeline and at this accessible price point, was less forgiving than the gap in real estate, and the brand paid a small toll each time it was crossed. The tolls were individually insignificant. Accumulated across a decade of products that underdelivered against their branding, they were not, and the ledger in which they were recorded, not in any financial statement, but in the aggregate of public impressions about what the Trump name actually guaranteed, was being maintained with a patience and precision that would eventually present its balance at a moment of Trump's choosing, in a context that no one examining his product launch calendar in 2007 could possibly have anticipated. Chapter 50. The 2012 Political Pregame. The ballroom at the Treasure Island Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas held approximately 2,000 people on the evening of February 2, 2012. And they had come, most of them, not because Mitt Romney needed the endorsement, but because Donald Trump was giving it. This distinction, so obvious in the room, so entirely underweighted in the subsequent coverage, was the essential fact of the evening. Romney stood beside Trump at the podium in the particular posture of a man who has calculated that the association serves his interests and has made his peace with the calculation, which is a posture distinguishable from enthusiasm by the set of the jaw and the quality of the smile, both of which Romney's face communicated with an involuntary transparency that his political advisers had spent years attempting to correct. Trump spoke first, as was his custom in any two-person arrangement, and he spoke for longer than the event's format required, and what he said was not primarily about Romney. It was about China. It was about OPEC. It was about the trade deficits that American negotiators had permitted to accumulate through a combination of ideological commitment to free markets and a naivety about the intentions of trading partners that Trump characterized as, in the specific word he returned to with the frequency of a man who had chosen it carefully, stupid. The crowd responded to this portion of the remarks with an enthusiasm that exceeded their response to the actual endorsement, which Romney received with a handshake and a nod, and the expression of a man accepting a gift whose wrapping he finds somewhat alarming. The Republican primary of 2012 was, by the winter of that year, resolving itself toward Romney with the grudging inevitability that often characterizes the consolidation of a party establishment around a candidate it respects without loving. Romney was capable, credentialed, and precisely the kind of figure, Mormon, moderate, managerial, that the party's donor class and its think tank infrastructure found reassuring, and that its populist base found inert. The Tea Party energy that had swept the 2010 midterms had not translated into a viable insurgent presidential candidate. Michelle Bachmann had collapsed after Iowa. Rick Perry had combusted in a series of debate performances whose most memorable moment was a 10-second pause, during which the governor of Texas could not recall the third federal agency he intended to eliminate. Herman Cain had withdrawn under the weight of harassment allegations, and Newt Gingrich, whose South Carolina primary victory had briefly suggested a more volatile race than the establishment preferred, was burning through the financial advantage that Sheldon Adelson's super PAC support had provided, without translating it into delegate mathematics that could sustain a path to the nomination. The base wanted something the field was not providing: an aggression, an unapologetic nationalism, a willingness to say that the country's problems were the result of bad decisions made by bad negotiators serving interests other than the American people's, rather than the structural complexity that policy professionals preferred to invoke. Trump had been saying exactly this for months, in a vocabulary that the primary field had been too cautious to adopt, and that he was free to deploy precisely because he was not running. His decision not to run in 2012, announced in May of 2011, framed as a business obligation, processed by the political press as a promotional maneuver concluded, had freed him into a political role that was in several respects more influential than candidacy would have permitted. A candidate is constrained by the requirements of the campaign, the fundraising calls, the retail politics of early states, the debate preparation, the need to produce policy positions detailed enough to survive scrutiny and consistent enough to be defensible across a year-long national conversation. A celebrity endorser and political commentator operates under none of these constraints. Trump in 2012 was on television as often as any declared candidate in the race, saying things about trade and China and American decline that no declared candidate was saying with equivalent force, and doing so without a campaign finance filing or a debate prep session or a pollster checking whether the message was moving numbers in New Hampshire. The freedom was structural, and Trump used it the way he used most structural advantages, to do things that the constrained parties could not do, and to ensure that the things he was doing were visible. The core conflict of the 2012 political pregame was a conflict of conversion, specifically the challenge of converting the attention he was generating as a political commentator into something more durable than attention. Attention, as Trump understood from his Apprentice years, was a resource with a half-life. It required continuous replenishment, continuous novelty, continuous escalation to maintain the level of engagement that made it valuable. The birther period had generated enormous attention and had built genuine political capital within the conservative base. But the release of Obama's long-form birth certificate had deflated the issue's energy as a media story. And Trump had not yet identified the successor argument. The economic nationalism themes about China and trade were promising, but they were competing in a media environment that was primarily focused on the primary race, on the unemployment rate, on the horse race of the campaign in ways that left limited oxygen for non-candidates' thematic arguments. He was speaking, consistently and with genuine conviction, about things that he believed the Republican field was failing to address. The question was whether the speaking was building something, an infrastructure of belief, a relationship with an audience, a political identity that would be retrievable in a future cycle, or whether it was simply filling the space that his visibility created without converting into the kind of durable political asset that future candidacy would require. The economic nationalism argument that Trump was developing in this period was not, in its intellectual content, original. Patrick Buchanan had argued against free trade agreements and for economic protectionism throughout the 1990s with considerable consistency and without achieving either primary success or mainstream Republican adoption of his positions. Ross Perot had made the manufacturing job loss argument in 1992 with a specificity, the giant sucking sound, that had proven more memorable than his electoral performance. What Trump added to the tradition was not a new argument, but a new register, an anger that was personal rather than philosophical, a characterization of the trading relationship with China and the negotiations that had produced it that was not about economic theory but about competence and betrayal, about the specific people who had sat across the table from Chinese negotiators and had, through stupidity or corruption or ideological rigidity, allowed arrangements to develop that served Chinese interests at American workers' expense. The argument was not structural. It was biographical or pseudo-biographical. It required villains, specific people who had made specific bad decisions, and it offered as the implicit solution not a revised trade policy but a different kind of person at the table. A better negotiator. Someone who understood what was happening and was not afraid to say it. The revealing action of this period is a speech that Trump delivered at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, in February of 2012, which represents the most sustained and politically developed public address he had given up to that point, and which functioned as an early blueprint for the thematic architecture of what would come 3 years later. He spoke for approximately 30 minutes to an audience of conservative activists and movement figures who received him with an enthusiasm that suggested something more than celebrity recognition, a recognition of content, of a set of arguments they had wanted to hear someone make on a stage of this visibility. He talked about China's currency manipulation as theft, not as a policy concern, but as a deliberate act by a foreign power conducted at the expense of American workers. He talked about OPEC as a cartel that laughed at American leaders behind their backs. He talked about the United States' relationships with its allies, countries that paid nothing for their own defense while American taxpayers subsidized it, with a contempt that was directed not at the allies themselves, but at the American negotiators who had permitted the arrangements to persist. And he talked about winning, about the experience of winning and losing, about the difference between a country that wins and a country that has forgotten how, about the specific psychological transformation required to go from accepting losing as normal to demanding winning as the only acceptable outcome. The crowd responded to the winning argument, the way crowds at revival meetings respond to the moment when the preacher's address becomes personal, with a recognition that the speaker is articulating something they feel but have not previously heard articulated at this pitch, in this register, on this stage. The relationship that most illuminates Trump's political development during this period is the one he was constructing, largely through media rather than in person, with the audience that conservative talk radio and Fox News delivered. Rush Limbaugh had not endorsed Trump and would not. Limbaugh's relationship with the Republican primary was too complex and too carefully managed for the kind of early, total endorsement that Trump's profile might have warranted. But the radio infrastructure that Limbaugh had built, and that figures like Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Mark Levin populated, was the medium through which Trump's economic nationalism arguments traveled most efficiently. Trump appeared on these programs with a regularity that was not accidental. He or his office initiated many of the appearances, and the hosts accommodated them because Trump delivered ratings and because what Trump was saying was, in its populist register, consistent with what their audiences wanted to hear. The relationship was symbiotic in the specific way that the most durable media relationships are. The host needed content that engaged the audience. Trump needed a platform that reached the audience. And the audience needed a figure whose prominence legitimized the arguments they had been making among themselves. Each party received what it required from the exchange, and the exchange recurred frequently enough to constitute something closer to a standing relationship than a series of discrete media appearances. By the fall of 2012, as Romney moved toward his November defeat, a defeat that Trump processed publicly and with considerable emphasis as a strategic failure rather than an ideological one, arguing on Twitter and on television that Romney had been insufficiently aggressive, had failed to make the economic argument forcefully enough, had allowed Obama to define him without adequate resistance, Trump was already engaged in the thinking that his subsequent political behavior would reflect. The loss was, from his vantage point, evidence not that the Republican coalition was too narrow, but that the Republican candidate had been too timid, that there existed a potential electorate for an aggressive economic nationalist argument that Romney had failed to mobilize because Romney was constitutionally incapable of making the argument that the electorate required. Trump did not say this privately, and differently than he said it publicly. What he said publicly was what he believed, and what he believed was that the election's lesson was about candidate quality rather than coalition structure, about the failure of a specific person to perform a specific function rather than the inadequacy of the Republican coalition to win a national majority. This reading of the 2012 result was contested by virtually every Republican strategist and analyst who conducted a postmortem on the campaign, most of whom argued that the party needed to broaden its appeal among Hispanic voters, among young voters, among suburban college-educated women, among the demographic groups whose growth was rendering the older, whiter coalition insufficient. Trump read the same data and arrived at a different conclusion, that the path was not expansion but intensification, not outreach to new constituencies but the full mobilization of a constituency that had been inadequately served by the candidates the party had been nominating. The intensification argument was, in 2012, a minority position within the Republican political class, dismissed by the professionals and the consultants and the RNC autopsy that Reince Priebus would commission in the months after the election with such institutional confidence that its dismissal felt less like a disagreement than a consensus. Trump noted the consensus and filed it. He returned to The Apprentice, which was still producing seasons and still delivering acceptable ratings, though the initial peak of the first season had not been recaptured, and the show's cultural centrality had diminished in proportion to the fragmentation of the television landscape that Netflix and YouTube were accelerating. He continued his real estate and licensing operations. He continued appearing on Fox News and calling in to talk radio. And he continued, in the specific way that people continue to do things that are building toward something they can feel but cannot yet fully see, to refine the argument, the trade argument, the winning argument, the argument about American decline and its causes, and the kind of leadership that its reversal required, with a patience that was not characteristic of him in most domains, but that in this one he seemed to understand, at a level below conscious strategy was necessary. The Republican establishment that produced the 2013 autopsy recommending Hispanic outreach and policy moderation had, in conducting its postmortem, made an analytical error that was understandable in context and catastrophic in consequence. It had assumed that the voters who had stayed home in 2012, the white working-class voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin who had not turned out for Romney in sufficient numbers, had stayed home because the candidate had failed to reach them, rather than because no candidate had yet found the argument that would make their participation feel worthwhile, and that the man who would eventually find that argument was already in possession of most of its components, was refining them on cable television, and at conservative conferences, and in tweet-length formulations that the political class was monitoring with bemusement rather than alarm, and was waiting, with a patience that his public persona entirely concealed, for the moment when the conditions that his argument required would finally arrive. The populist revolt and the 2016 campaign, 2015-2016.